Hello everybody, it's me, the Friendly Englishman. Thank you so much for joining me for part 9 of my Seer audiobook series. This is chapter 8, Hunters, Scavengers and Prey. I am very sorry, Herr Kempf, Otto Ali said. The Arabian wore a broad smile that was as genuine as a Kislevite teetotaler. In the gloom of the drug den, however, Kempf couldn't see the nervous tremor in the man's face or the anxiety in his eyes. As you can see, the hooks raided my establishment while you were enjoying the dust dreams. Otto Ali spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness, indicating the smashed bunks and general disorder of the dust parlour's main room. He didn't expect that the damage had been caused by feuding ratmen, the same ratmen who supplied him with the black dust. "But my purse is gone," Kemp protested. "I had 20 shimmies in there." "They must have stolen it while you were dreaming," apologised Otto Ali. "I am afraid they robbed me of my customers when they burst through the door." Kempf glanced in the direction of the door in question. The Arabian hoped the smuggler didn't look too closely at it and noticed that it was broken out rather than in. Kempf scratched at his neck, feeling sick and disgusted by what he was hearing. His face wrinkled in disgust as his arm rose. "What did they do? Piss on me while they were at it?" "Some men have strange ideas of amusement," Otto Ali said. He saw anger flare up in Kempf's eyes. "When someone has a knife pressing against my belly, I don't tell him what he can and can't do," the dust dealer explained. Robbed, humiliated, his stomach turning with sickness and his skin feeling like ants were crawling beneath it, Kempf wanted to scream, to let all the pent-up outrage loose in one furious howl. Instead, the fire in his eyes faded into glassy hunger, and when he spoke, it was in a shallow whisper. "But I needed that silver," Kempf muttered, more to himself than the Arabian. He lifted his now pitiful face to stare at Otto Ali. "You will make good on my loss. I don't mean in money, but rather in kind." Otto Ali's smile became a great deal colder, but far more genuine. "I had misfortune enough already, Herr Kempf. I cannot compound on my own losses by assuming those of my patrons." "But I was robbed here." "Here or in the street, I cannot afford to make it my concern," said the dust dealer. "If you seek charity, I suggest a chalet and hospice." A shrewd gleam came into Otto Ali's eye. "The hooks left enough dust for those who can pay." Kempf clutched at the Arabian's arm, his face turning a sickly shade of green. "You mustn't," the smuggler pleaded. "First come, first served," Otto Ali said. "Those with coin to pay, that is." "I can get the money," Kempf swore, his voice cracking with emotion. "Please, just give me a few hours." "Don't be too long," warned Otto Ali, but the smuggler had already released him and was dashing through the hastily repaired door of the drug den. The Arabian watched the little man run off, his contempt for the man's pathetic addiction twisting his face into a sneer. "Does it dare bare its teeth fangs?" a shrill voice snarled from nearby. Otto Ali quickly threw himself to the floor, abasing himself as Seer Thanquol and his apprentice Cratch emerged from one of the curtained alcoves. Despite his many years as a pawn of the Skaven, he still sometimes forgot that the ratmen regarded a smile as a threatening display. With the sneaks and spies of Clan Skull, such an oversight was dangerous, He goes to get more of the stone, Otto Ali said, his face still turned to the floor. Thanquol pressed his clawed foot on the man's neck. Scream! Remind your pet that it does not squeak to me. The ears of a grey seer are not for the chitter-chatter of man things. The crook-backed clan school spy and several of his underlings cowered around the grey seer, looking almost as miserable as the Arabian dust dealer. Their scent was heavy with the odour of submission, their snouts held much lower than that of Thanquol. No danger of any of the ratmen forgetting about keeping their teeth hidden behind their lips. Great and malicious potentate, Scrim whined. Your brilliant plan plot proceeds. Enough whining, Thanquol snapped. Set your trackers after the thief meet. Scrim hastened to chastise and bully his cadre of Skaven sneaks. The wiry ratmen pulled coarse brown cloaks and hoods tight about themselves and rushed after the departed Kemp. They will seek him soon, master teacher. Cratch's wheezily rasp sounded in Thanquol's ear. Of course they would, Thanquol thought. Even the mongrel, degenerate Skaven of Under Altdorf couldn't fail to follow such an easy trail. It had been a stroke of genius to spray the sleeping thief man with his own musk. The lowest Skaven slave could not fail to follow a fleeing human smelling of a grey seer's scent. Cratch, Thanquol said, turning his head ever so slightly to regard his apprentice. Gather Burnthang's warriors and my other minions. Have them ready for when Scrim's sniffers run this thief meat to ground. Cratch's face grew pinched, his whiskers twitching. You anticipate trouble danger, wise brave overlord? Thanquol brought his staff smacking down against Cratch's snout. Don't ask. Just do what I tell, say. Rubbing his injured snout, the rebuked Cratch loped away, scurrying down the crude tunnel that connected Otto Ali's lair to the sewer runs of the Skaven. Thanquol felt better sending the adept to bring the rest of his underlings where he needed them. If Scarpaw had any backup assassins waiting in the sewers, there was always a chance they might mistake the apprentice for the master. That happy thought set Thanquol's tail twitching. Cratch was the last possible informant for the Council of 13 that remained among his followers since Scarpaw had obligingly removed the last of the white storm vermin. If the traitor could be convinced to do the same to Cratch, things would be much simpler for Thanquol's plans. The closer he came to the Wormstone, the more he wondered if he really wanted to deliver it to the Lords of Decay. Wouldn't such a weapon be of more benefit to Skavendom in the paws of one who had the will and vision to use it properly? Wouldn't that be following the true wishes of the Horned Rat? Thanquol turned to inspect some of the dead addicts who had been left in the lair. He wanted to see what long-term effects abuse of black dust had on them. It might help him judge better what effect the Wormstone might be expected to have on humans who had not been broken by the whips and claws of Clan Moulder. As he moved, Thanquol absently noticed that the thing beneath his foot was now a corpse. In his angry outburst against Cratch's insolent stupidity, he must have put too much pressure on the Arabian's neck. Irritably, Thanquol kicked the listless thing and continued on his way to inspect more interesting carcasses. Johan held up his hand, motioning the rotund apothecary to silence. If Galen is mentioned one more time, I will send you to consult him directly. he warned. It had been difficult to find a physician anywhere near the Crown and two chairmen. The closest he had come was a drunken barber surgeon in the Pink Rat and a bleary-eyed horse doctor cheating at cards in the Wayfarer's Rest. The most professional prospect he had discovered was an apothecary at the Matthias II Tavern, who had only just started unwinding after closing up shop. Not too deep in his cups and quite amenable to earning a few gold crowns for his medical knowledge, Sergei Kowalski agreed to postpone his battle of Reichland Hock to accompany Johan back to examine his brother. The results weren't exactly what Johan had hoped for. The apothecary had puttered around, poking and prodding hands for the better part of an hour, sometimes pausing to make dour observations or scratch his chin in befuddlement, always reciting the journals of the long-dead founder of modern medicine to lend some manner of veracity to his confusion. Hans, at least, was oblivious to the apothecary's dubious expertise. The smuggler chief was sleeping, his skin more pallid and drawn than before, ugly, tumour-like growths visible beneath his flesh. A little trickle of noxious-smelling slime oozed from the corners of his mouth, every bit as vile as the spittle expelled by his frequent coughing. Wilhelm and Müller had abandoned the room and its stench, pushed to their limits. The two outlaws were downstairs, lingering in the bar room, ostensibly keeping an eye out for Volk or the watch. Johan wondered how long it would be before the two rogues decided to desert entirely. Only the promise of selling the Weirdstone had kept them loyal this long. Any hint that they might catch whatever was wrong with Hans and they'd be gone faster than a side of beef at an ogre's wedding. Argula was curled in a chair, the limit of her endurance reached, sleeping even more deeply than Hans, so tired she hadn't even the strength to replace her soiled blouse, just discarding the stained garment in a corner. Sergei had trouble keeping his eyes from straying back to the woman's buxom undress. Johan wondered what Galen would have to say about the apothecary's distraction. "So, what's wrong with him?" Johan asked. Sergei slid his spectacles down his broad nose and peered above the thick lenses to stare at the smuggler. "I can't be sure. It might be reichworms or possibly crowpox." "Crowpox only strikes ravens, falcons and hawks," a stern voice corrected the apothecary. Both men turned to see a white-clad figure standing in the doorway of the room. Johan's mouth dropped open in disbelief as his mind understood exactly what he was looking at. Rothsfels had been on the level after all. The woman standing in the doorway was a priestess of Shalia, the goddess of healing and mercy. Eleni Clythoff stepped into the room, her movements self-assured. "And I should think even the lowest medical man in Altdorf would have seen reichworms often enough to realise that brown sputum is not one of that affliction's symptoms." The priestess, crouching beside the bed, placing her hand against Hans's forehead, smelling his breath and listening to his breathing. Johan turned on the dumbfounded apothecary. "Get out!" You aren't falling for a bunch of religious mummery," protested Sergei. "Call me strange, but I think she knows what she's talking about, unlike some people," Johan answered, shoving the apothecary towards the door. But my fee!" Johan gave the bespectacled man a none-too-gentle push out of the room. "A man gets what he earns," Johan said, his voice low and menacing. "Right now, I'm tempted to throw you down those stairs." Sergei needed no further encouragement. With a last lustful look at Argula, the apothecary fled down the hallway. Johan turned back to his brother and the priestess. Clythoff had his shirt open, her ear pressed against his chest. It had been many years since Johan had given serious consideration to the gods, except of course to call upon Werner to keep the watch away. But even he felt reassured just seeing the priestess ministering to his brother. "Can you tell what ails him?" Johan dared to ask. The priestess looked up at the smuggler, feeling a little knife of guilt stab at her as she saw the hope and faith in his face. She was tempted to tell him the truth. Instead, she told him what she had been told to tell him. "He has been exposed to something that had corrupted his humours," the priestess said. "Has he come into contact with anything unnatural?" Clythoff studied Johan's face intently, watching for the slight flicker of suspicion that told her the smuggler had an idea of what might be responsible. "If I am to treat this man, I must know what has brought this ailment upon him. Even better, if I should be able to examine it for myself." Clythoff did not press the suggestion further. She was silent as Johan made his own calculations. He was wondering about the supposed weird stone, wondering if it could have been the source of the disease. He was weighing the reported value of the stone against his brother's life. At length, he reached the decision the priestess knew he would make. "I think I know what might have done this," Johan said, already moving towards the door. "Stay with him, and I'll bring a sample of it back to you." Clythoff nodded her agreement, and Johan was gone. The priestess shook her head, asking Shalia for forgiveness for her deception of the man. At least, she reflected, her part in it was over. Ludwig Rossfeld would take up Johan's trail when he left the tavern, following him to whatever hiding spot the smugglers had secreted their find. Ludwig would be the one to make the final report to the master and bring him to his objective. Looking at Hans and noting his suffering, Clythoff only hoped that the source of this terrible corruption could be found in time, that it could be stopped before the infection spreads. Kempf carefully made his way through the alleyways and side streets of Altdorf's waterfront. A slinking shadow veiled by the thick fog rolling over the river Reich. He was careful to keep his body pressed close to the plaster and timber walls of the district's run-down buildings, darting across muddy lanes quickly only when absolutely necessary. He felt like a fish out of water during those brief moments of exposure, imagining hostile eyes watching him with grim fixation. He saw in every stumbling drunk, in every grumbling stevedore or swaggering sailor, one of Gustav Volk's murderous crew. He knew the thugs had been keeping a watch over the Orc and Axe, waiting for their chance to nab any of Dietrich's gang. He had slipped past the roguish watchers before with contemptuous ease, but Kemp's paranoia was feeding off his desperate need. Fear that Otto Ali would sell the last of his diminished supply of black dust had become frantic imaginings that this time he would be caught by Volk's skulking killers. Kempf was so worried about watchers between himself and the tavern, he was blind to any threat from behind. He was unaware that he had been followed from Otto Ali's, followed by spotters far more capable than any of Altdorf's criminal scum. Scrim, Nortail, and his cloaked brethren kept their distance from their quarry, never giving him the chance to discover their presence. The Skaven did not need to keep their eyes on the smuggler, instead using their keen noses to follow the pungent scent Thanquol had sprayed on the man's clothes. every few blocks, Scrim would detach one of his little mob of trackers, sending a rat man scurrying for a sewer opening. The messenger would squirm down the narrow holes with a sickeningly boneless motion, wriggling his body like an eel to slip into the reeking blackness beneath the streets. The messengers would report to the Grey Seer and his entourage, following Scrim's progress from the tunnels under the city. When Kempf got wherever he was going, Thanquol's troops would be ready to act swiftly and brutally. Johann Dietrich opened the door to the disused cellar and began to carefully make his way down the rickety set of steps, never letting too much of his weight rest on any one foot. It had been a test of his skills at silence and caution to slip past the cordon of thugs watching the orc and axe. Many times Johann had been certain he would be discovered, despite the grey veil of fog that assisted his efforts. Twice he had been almost under the very nose of one of the racketeers before he realized they were even there. Both times he had been spared discovery by the grace of Renald, the lurking watchers distracted at the last instant by some sound or shift in the fog. Now close to his goal, Johann was even more cautious. If Volk had discovered the Weirdstone, then he would have his best men guarding the cellar, certain that the smugglers would return for their plunder. His senses keyed to even the slightest disturbance as he descended into the steps. Johann became aware of a slight tapping. Muffled, only a faint murmur in the air, but persistent and hurried. It was a strange sort of sound, one Johann had a difficult time connecting with lurking guards. He slowly drew his knife, a fat, bladed scrapmonger's knockoff of the infamous Magnin throwing dagger. Its balance was off, making it useless for anything approaching accuracy, but its broad edge and spear-like tip made it perfect for gutting unsuspecting thugs. Tightening his grip about the handle of his knife, Johann quietly set his foot on the cellar floor. The gloom of the dusty basement was almost as thick as that of a coal mine, but even so, Johann could pick out the faint suggestion of movement coming from one corner. The same corner the muffled tapping sounds were coming from. Johann started to creep towards the noise, then decided he still could not reconcile the sound with any waiting killer. The smuggler turned, navigating through the darkness by memory rather than sight. He found the little table and its half-used candles. Scratching a match against the splintered wood, he brought the candles sputtering into life. The light from even so feeble a source was like the brilliance of a small sun compared to the darkness that had preceded its advent. The tapping noise came to an abrupt halt. Johann saw a man scramble away from the barrel of vinegar, a hammer wrapped in goatskin falling from his fingers, his other hand closing tightly around an iron chisel. Propped against the rim of the barrel, its surface still dripping with vinegar, was the Weirdstone. "I was wondering where you'd gone to," Johann snarled. "Taking your cut a little early, aren't you, Kempf?" "Stay back," the little man growled back, gripping the chisel like it was a Tillian stiletto. "You stay back," Johann said, striding forward, contemptuous of the thief's threat. "Hans is sick. Kleiner too." He pointed the tip of his knife at the Weirdstone. "I think that is what made him that way." Kemp's face twisted into an ugly smile. "Don't try to spread dragon dung over my pasture, Johann. I'm a better liar than you'll ever be." "It's not a lie," Johann said. He took another step forwards, forcing the cringing thief back a space. "Now back off. I need a piece of that thing for Hans. You can have the whole damn thing after that." Kemp's eyes narrowed. His expression became even more weasel-like. He uttered a short bark of laughter. "Oh, sure. You can take a little sliver and leave the rest to me. Leave me to rake in all the cars and clanks while you just go on your merry way to fix your dear brother. What'd you take me for? Stupid?" "Yes," Johan growled. The blade of his knife flickered menacingly in the candlelight, catching Kemp's nervous gaze. Suddenly, the thief's face broke into a malicious smile. "You can't kill me," he said, his voice shrewd. Kemp pointed at the ceiling. "Folks' men are right up there. Any noise down here and they might investigate. Then where will you be?" "Your head's in the same noose," Johan said. Kemp nodded in agreement, but his expression lost none of its cunning. "True, but I'm willing to gamble that you have more to lose than me." The smuggler licked his lips hungrily, casting a covetous glance at the weird stone, seeing not the rock itself but what it represented to him. He scratched at his neck, stifling a cough as he considered his next move. Johan watched his every move with intense study. "I'll take the weird stone with me," Kempf decided at last. "Not just a little bit, all of it. In return, you don't get killed by folk." "It's a fool's bargain, Kempf," Johan said, still watching the thief scratch at his skin. There was an ugly pallor to the ferret-faced man, a sickly thinness to him that made Johan think of Hans. The priestess was right. The stone was the source of the poison. "You know I'm telling the truth about Hans and Kleiner. The stone made them sick, the same as you." A snicker of scorn passed through Kemp's lips. "Nice try, Johan," he said, "but I know what's wrong with me." Kemp looked longingly at the weird stone again, "and I know how to make it all better." Johan braced himself, watching as Kemp circled back around towards the barrel. The thief was no fighter, but there was no question that his wiry frame was no match for Johan's brawn. But it would have to be a quick fight, 1 or 2 stabs of his knife. Any more than that, and Johan knew Kemp would shout to bring Volk's men running. He watched the thief's movements, waiting for the opening that would allow him to bring quick death to the traitorous cur. Any plans that Johan made were exploded along with the back wall and part of the floor. A cloud of brick dust washed over both smugglers as they were thrown against the far wall by the violent discharge, their heads ringing with the deafening roar. For an instant, Johan could smell some sort of explosive powder. Then the scent was burned away by rancid stench that erupted from the cellar, the stink of sewers and beasts. Johan heard Kemp scream, a lingering wail that threatened to break his voice. The big smuggler shook his head, trying to force some kind of focus to his eyes. The blast had extinguished the candle, but weird green fire clung to the shattered brickwork scattered throughout the cellar, casting an unreal light across his surroundings. He saw the black cavity of the basement's broken wall, pouring through it with things even more unreal than the light that illuminated them. Slinking, verminous shapes moving with what was at once half scurry and half sprint, their heads leering from beneath ragged hoods and rusty helmets, beady eyes gleaming as they reflected the eerie green glow. They were the things from nightmare and childhood fear, half-believed myths that refused to be purged from the unconscious. The ratkin, the loathsome underfolk, ghastly legend transformed into hideous, chattering flesh. As the swarm of ratmen poured into the cellar, Johan saw one swagger through the pack. A tall, horned figure clad in mangy grey robes. "Take snatch the stone!" Grey Seer Thanquol snarled to his underlings. The Skaven's beady eyes caught those of Johan, and his lips pulled back in a fang-ridden smile. "Kill, slay the meat." As the slinking ratmen began to converge upon their prey, a hissing peal of laughter brought them up short. A strange, trilling sound came from everywhere and nowhere. The laughter seemed to be more like a chorus of serpents than anything rising from a human throat. Thanquol felt his hackles rise, instinctive terror clenching his glands. The lesser Skaven around him cringed and cowered. The air grew cold, warmth draining from it like blood from a severed vein. Thanquol gripped the shoulder of Cratch, pulling the apprentice in front of him as the dark shadows clinging to the walls of the cellar seemed to swell. They seemed to take on depth and substance. Ratmen whined and muttered in fear as their sharp eyes detected motion within the shadows. Warriors backed away, the fur on their backs standing on end. Scrim's sneak slithered beneath the bigger ratmen, trying to squirm their way back into the sewers. Warlock engineers nervously began drawing strange weapons and sinister glass spheres from beneath their tattered robes. Ignorant or uncaring of how many of their own kind they should kill, using such terrible devices within the closed confines of the basement. The air became foul with the musk of fear as the nebulous shadows assumed shape and form. Great pantherous figures that prowled menacingly towards the ratkin. Rat soldiers, unable to retreat from the shadows because of the press of bodies behind them, lashed at the dark shapes with their swords and spears, desperately trying to fend off their approach. Thanquol fought against his instinctive horror of the immense, cat-like shadows, his lust for power warring against his compulsion towards self-preservation. The Grey Seer's scheming mind rose through the fog of terror, denied the weakness of glands and flesh. The wormstone was near. Absolute power was within his grasp. He would not be cheated of his triumph by shadows and the treacherous cowardice of his underlings. The Grey Seer's eyes told him the feline horrors were real. His ears could hear their stealthy feet padding across the floor. But there was something wrong, something missing. The panthers carried no scent. Ghost or illusion, it was enough to decide Thanquol's mind. He threw Cratch's cringing form from him and lifted his staff high. "No, no, fear fright!" His scratchy voice bellowed, rippling with rage. "This is trick lie. It is false scent. Nothing but shadow burned away by light wrath of the Horned One." As he raged, Thanquol brought the butt of his staff crashing against the floor. The metal icon at its head blazed into brilliance, the white-hot explosion of a star. Creeping shadows were thrown back, ripped to shreds of blackness by the light. They slithered and wormed their way across the floor like living things, converging at the foot of the stairs. There they gathered, like frightened curs, about the feet of a sinister figure cloaked in grey. Thanquol blinked nervously as he met a pair of dark, stormy eyes that seemed to burn into his own. "Kill, kill!" the Grey Seer roared, jabbing a claw in the direction of the now visible wizard. Even as he roared, however, Thanquol was flinging himself to the floor. Only the speed of the Skaven's instincts saved him as shadowy blades of sorcery swept through the air above him, skewering a warlock engineer that had been standing right behind him. By burning away the shadow shapes, Thanquol had exposed the real enemy, but in doing so he had made himself the target of choice for that enemy's retaliation. The Grey Seer's distress, however, was not noticed by the chittering horde of ratmen. With vengeful snarls, the Skaven rushed for the lone wizard, their feral minds gripped by indignant fury. The terror of the cat phantoms had touched upon their most primordial fears. That was an outrage even the lowest ratman could not forgive. The Magister held his ground, hissing his contempt for the massed attack. His hands swept before him in an arcane gesture. The shadows gathered about his feet, rushed forwards, crushing down about the ratmen like an icy wave. Instantly they were plunged into darkness. The brilliant glow of Thanquol's magic cut off from them. Panicked by their blindness, the Skaven began to cut and stab at one another, fearfully trying to fight off imagined attackers. It was only a momentary confusion, however. The Skaven had other senses, sharper even than their sight. Soon, despite their fear, they would remember them and rise once more to the attack. The wizard was not going to give them that chance. "Up the stairs," the Magister ordered the two smugglers cowering against the wall as he drew a slender sword from his belt. As the wizard's hand closed about the grip, crawling tendrils of blackness coiled from his fingers, rushing up the length of the blade, turning it into a thing of shadow and metal. Only for an instant did the wizard's smoky eyes linger on the two criminals. Then he was gone, merging into the darkness he had sent to engulf the ratkin. Sounds of battle rose from the blackness, the terrified screams of ratmen as their bodies were slashed by ensorcelled steel. Johan picked himself up from the floor, risking a look at Kempf cowering nearby. The thief was huddled into a trembling ball, muttering to himself in a childlike voice over and over again. "The dreams are true, the dreams are true." Johan's skin crawled just hearing the madman, his mind broken by the advent of the ratkin, horror heaped atop horror. Johan turned to race up the stairs, but the sounds of battle stayed him, stabbing at the core of his rough pride. He did not know why the sinister wizard had appeared to save them from the fangs of the underfolk. He did not know if his rescuer was mortal man or slinking night fiend, witch or sorcerer. All that mattered was that he was human enough to oppose the verminous ratkin. No man could abandon a fighter to such foes and still call himself a man. Tightening his grip on his knife, Johan prowled at the periphery of the roiling mass of darkness, stabbing and slashing those ratmen who emerged from the wall of shadow. For all their horror, for all the mythical dread they filled his mind with, the things bled when Johan cut them. Filthy black blood that sizzled as it erupted from their wounds. Confused, disorientated by the change from darkness to light, the ratmen escaping the wall of shadow made poor opponents for all their inhuman quickness. Johan cut them down with butchering strokes that tore throats and gashed faces, as pitiless as Sigmar's vengeance. Johan was remembering all the fright tales he had heard as a child about the underfolk and their hideous habits, about their fondness for the soft flesh of babies and children. Such things were not deserving of mercy. Grey Seer Thanquol waited for the sounds of battle to reach him before rising from the floor. The priest-sorcerer ground his fangs together in a mix of fear and fury. It was outrageous that some miserable man-thing playing at magic should try to stand between him and ultimate glory. Thanquol would sweep the filthy warlock from his path like a flea on his backside. There was no chance the petty spells of a human could stand against the primordial might of Skaven sorcery. Thanquol started to move towards the wall of shadow, the icon on his staff crackling with energy. Beyond that wall of darkness was the wormstone. He could smell its sickly odour. He salivated at the thought of the awesomely powerful artifact in his paws, then reminded himself about the lethal consequences of handling it. A particularly high-pitched wail from one of the Skaven fighting the wizard reminded him of the lethal consequences of entering that unnatural darkness as well. With all of his might and power, Thanquol knew there was only one thing he could do. All around him, Thanquol was surrounded by ratmen who were less than eager to join their embattled kin, warlock engineers. Clan school lurkers, a few survivors of Thanquol's contingent from Clan Moulder. The Grey Seer ignored all of them, his teeth gleaming in a savage grin as he spotted the skulking ratman he wanted. "Cratch!" Thanquol snarled. "Fetch Steel the stone!" The apprentice cringed as he heard his master's command. His mouth dropped open to squeak a protest, but the fire in Thanquol's eyes made him close it again. Instead, he snapped at some of the clan scryer ratmen around him. If he was going to risk his pelt bravely covering for his mentor's cowardice, he was determined not to share the danger alone. Thanquol watched his apprentice scurry into the clinging darkness, flanked by several warlock engineers and clan school sneaks. With them they bore the huge iron box Viscit Burnfang had prepared to convey the wormstone safely. Then there was no more time for amusement. The wall of darkness collapsed suddenly, revealing a tangle of stabbing, clawing ratmen and their fallen brethren. Thanquol's stomach turned as he saw the litter of bodies strewn around the fighting Skaven. Confused by the darkness and the presence of an elusive enemy who weaved a path through their swarming ranks, the ratmen had turned their swords against whatever was close to them. They had done an excellent job of butchering their comrades. It wasn't the confused infighting and the resulting carnage that disturbed Thanquol. He didn't care a pellet for the dead and maimed warriors. What concerned him was the grim apparition their stupid frenzy had allowed to stalk right through their ranks. The Grey Seer felt a tremor of fear as he once again found himself locking eyes with the wizard's stormy gaze. He reached for Burnfang to pull the warlock engineer in front of him, but the coward cravenly slipped away from Thanquol's grasping paw. Fortunately, Burnfang's underlings had stronger spleens. A few broke and scurried back into the sewer, but others raised a riotous array of heavy pistols, warp-lock weapons fitted with scopes, and strange mechanized loading clips. The ratmen snarled their hate at their sinister foe. Thanquol managed to squeak a hurried "Fuck you!" as the warlock engineers pulled the triggers of their weird weapons, allowing him to maintain an illusion of command. Thick black smoke billowed from the volley, bringing tears to the eyes of the ratmen. One warlock engineer shrieked as his overly complicated pistol exploded in his face, but the rest of the volley smashed into the grey-cloaked phantom. Warp stone bullets capable of exploding steel plate slashing through the unarmoured wizard. Thanquol chittered in victory. Nothing could survive such a point-blank assault. The Grey Seer's laughter was drowned out by the shrieks and wails of Skaven warriors. As the smoke cleared, Thanquol saw many of the clan rat fighters in the centre of the cellar topple and fall, writhing in pained heaps. The wizard stood, seemingly unharmed, glowering at the Skaven shooters. Then, as though built of smoke himself, the motionless form of the Magister disintegrated, shattering into shreds of darkness, an illusion, another of the human's insufferable tricks. Mocking laughter rose from the wall, once again wrapped in shadow and blackness. From that darkness, like a cave shark rising from the pitch depths of a subterranean pool, the wizard stepped forwards, his icy blade held menacingly before him. Warlock engineers squeaked in terror, fumbling and pawing at ammunition belts as they tried to reload their pistols. Those few with mechanical loading devices fired at the Magister, but their shots were hurried and ill-aimed, the closest whizzing over the wizard's hood. None of the clan Scryer ratmen had a chance to recover. The wizard was among them, stabbing and slashing, spilling maimed Skaven into whimpering heaps. Many of the ratmen broke, fleeing down the sewer. Viscit Burnfang and Scrim Nortail leading the wail. Abandoned, feeling the full measure of his predicament, Thanquol drew upon his magic for desperate and brutal salvation. Lightning crackled about the head of his staff as he used the metal icon to channel his sorcery. Snarling, Thanquol pointed the staff at the lone human slaughtering his minions. Searing green tendrils of malevolence burned and seared through the bodies of intervening ratmen, but the wizard himself faded from the magical assault, seeming to melt back into the clinging darkness. Thanquol ground his teeth, ripping at one of the rat-skin scrolls at his belt. The spells he had bought, the power contained in the scrolls, would obliterate the annoying human. Thanquol tore the little rat-gut string sealing the rolled parchment, his lips already parted to begin squeaking the incantation. He stared in disbelief at the scratch-slash symbols that greeted his gaze. This scroll wasn't the same one he had purchased. The snivelling black martyr had pulled a switch. Instead of a spell to draw magical energy from the aether and weave it into a ball of annihilating fire, what Thanquol was looking at was some kitchen rat's recipe for goblin goulash. A blast of gathered shadow smashed into Thanquol with the force of a hammer, throwing him to the ground. His staff leapt from his fingers, clattering against the floor. Little fingers of darkness wrapped about it, dragging it away from his grasping fingers. Frantic, Thanquol pulled a nugget of warpstone from beneath his robe, but before he could stuff it into his mouth, a stabbing knife of blackness tore it from his paw. Snarling in fearful rage, Thanquol lifted his eyes to see the grey-cloaked Magister looming above him, his ensorcelled sword poised for a final downward thrust. Thanquol cringed, bracing himself for an ignoble end. Then a cruel smile spread across his face. Just as the wizard loomed above the prone grey seer, a hulking shape loomed above the wizard. Thanquol's chittering laughter scratched at the wizard's ears in the same instant as Bone Ripper's huge fist slammed into his body. Johan slashed at the final ratman, his big knife almost severing its spine. The mangled thing flopped to the floor, crawling in a pathetic pile to die in a corner. The numbers of ratmen breaking from the conflict raging amid the wizard's veil of shadow had thinned. After an initial surge of 3, they had continued in their 1s and 2s until Johan had accounted for 8 of the vermin. The smuggler was breathing hard, sweat dripping from every pore, his arms feeling like numb lumps of lead hanging from his shoulders. He wondered if there was an inch of skin on his body that hadn't been cut or scratched by the blades and claws of the ratkin. He was only thankful that none of their snapping fangs had managed to sink into the meat of his flesh. The smuggler hoped the wizard was holding his own, because Johan doubted he had the strength left to even muster the most feeble of assistance. Then again, for all he knew, the wizard could just snap his fingers and vanish any time he wanted, leaving Johan alone to face the vengeful horde. Alone save for a whimpering madman, Johan corrected himself. He turned his face to look at Kempf curled up against the wall. What he saw sent a thrill of horror down his spine. 5 ratmen had gotten through the wall of shadow without his notice. The slinking vermin had circled around the conflict as best they could, intent not upon adding their numbers to the combat, but upon some other purpose. Johan felt he knew what the monsters were after. "Oh, monsters!" the smuggler shouted, forcing himself to lift his knife once more. Johan's thoughts were of his brother, lying sick and dying in the bed of a whore. The one chance he had might lie in bringing some piece of the weird stone back to the priestess. Johan had been ready to kill Kempf, to risk certain death from Volk's thugs, to secure the sample he needed. He would be damned if he was going to abandon his brother because of some slinking fairy tale monsters. The ratmen spun about, snarling at the smuggler. One of them, a wiry creature with little stubby horns, cluttered a command to the others. 2 of the ratkin drew long, rusty swords and began to creep towards Johan. These weren't confused, half-blind refugees fleeing from a fight. Johan could see their scorn for any threat he posed to them shining in their beady eyes. Their fangs gleamed in the weird green light, pink tongues licking hungrily at their furry snouts. Johan's earlier combat against the ratkin had been butchery. This, he knew, would be a fight. A fight it was unlikely he could walk away from. Cratch snickered as he watched the foolish human try to stand its ground. The clan school sneaks would make short work of the stupid animal, unless of course they chose to take their time with it. He dismissed the killers and their quarry from his mind. He had bigger concerns to occupy him. Cratch turned and snapped commands to the 2 warlock engineers who had managed to keep up with the adept as he slipped through the veil of shadows. The 2 Skaven scurried forwards, setting their heavy iron box down on the floor. Beside the box, glowing with the same eerie light he had seen before, the wormstone seemed to welcome Cratch as he stretched his paw to seize it. The adept managed to resist the self-destructive urge. He knew exactly what the properties of the wormstone were, and what it would do to any Skaven stupid enough to touch it. It was a little detail he had kept from Skarbrit, something he had tried to keep from Thanquol, though his new master had managed to discover it for himself through Bernfang's experiments. "Take fetch! Quick, quick!" Cratch snarled at the warlock engineers. The masked ratmen stared at each other through their bug-eyed goggles, then back to the mass of darkness behind them. Their job had been to carry the box. Another pair of engineers had been tasked with carrying the metal tongs to transfer the wormstone into the box. They knew only too well the horrific effects of being exposed to the stone. "Quick, quick!" Cratch repeated, a greenish glow burning behind his eyes as the adept summoned his sorcerer's powers. The display was enough to overcome the hesitancy of the engineers. Using their thick leather gauntlets and praying to the horned rat that it would be enough protection, the 2 ratmen converged on the wormstone. With indecent haste, they seized the thing and dropped it into the waiting casket. One of the warlock engineers slammed the lid home while the other threw his tainted gloves away with a frightened squeak. Cratch patted the box affectionately. He looked back at the melee between the clan school lurkers and the human. The man was somehow holding them back, but Cratch could tell they would soon break through its fatigued defences. The apprentice wasn't of a mind to wait for them to finish playing with the animal. He had bigger fleas to scratch. "Back to the tunnel!" Cratch growled. The warlock engineers hefted the iron box from the floor, once again chittering little prayers to the horned rat that Burnfang's precautions would actually work. They nearly dropped their heavy burden when the wall of shadows suddenly collapsed upon itself. Cratch leapt backwards, landing on all fours, his eyes wide with alarm. But when he saw the grey-cloaked figure confronting Thanquol beyond where the magical darkness had been, the apprentice's lips pulled back in a predatory smile. "To the tunnel," he repeated. Cratch let the warlock engineers lead the way, carefully picking a path through the crazed Skaven warriors ripping and tearing at each other. There was a hideous instant when the warlock engineers who had remained with the Grey Seer fired at the human wizard, their bullets passing through the apparition to strike the ratmen beyond, but the shots were wide of Cratch and his crew. Besides, the follow-up to the wasted fusillade played right into the adept's paws. His image broken, the wizard himself emerged from the darkness to confront Thanquol, slashing his way through the clan scryer shooters. Most of the Skaven broke and ran, abandoning Thanquol to his enemy. Cratch seized the opening, urging his underlings down the tunnel. Cratch hurried after, dodging aside as the immense bulk of Bone Ripper charged up the passageway, rushing to his master's aid. The rat ogre had been left behind in the sewer, the warlock engineers protesting that it would take too much explosive to widen the opening to allow the monster to enter the cellar. Reluctantly, Thanquol agreed to their incessant whining. Cratch ground his fangs together. The rat ogre smashed into the man-thing wizard just as the humans were about to put an end to the thieving career of Thanquol. The brute tore his own opening into the cellar, while his third hand formed a bludgeoning fist that smashed into the human and sent him flying across the basement. Cratch saw tentacles of shadow wrap about the cloaked figure, deadening the violence of his impact against the wall as completely as one of Thrakqui's overstuffed pillows. Cratch cursed as he saw Thanquol start to rise from the floor. The trickle of dust falling from Bone Ripper's impromptu widening of the tunnel gave Cratch an idea. Most of the spells Scarbrit had seen fit to teach his apprentice were minor incantations of no great consequence, but there was one his late teacher had foolishly taught him that held real power. Grinning, Cratch called upon that power now, weaving his paws before him in a complex pattern, syllables rasping off his tongue with rapid-fire quickness. The roof of the tunnel groaned. Dirt trickled down in a steady stream. Cratch locked eyes with Thanquol, then spun about and hurried down the tunnel, pursuing the warlock engineers and their burden. Behind him, the adept heard a terrible roar. He coughed as a cloud of dust washed over him, propelled by the fury of the collapse. Cratch was almost disappointed. He had thought he would need to come up with something new to get rid of Thanquol. Instead, the same trick that had caught Scarbrit had been good enough. The apprentice Grey Seer scurried down the tunnel, chittering his wicked glee at the destruction of his hated master, his slippery mind already poring over his next move. He would seize the Wormstone, take it to some secure place, and then ransom the deadly weapon to one of the Lords of Decay. The hoary old rats would pay anything to keep such a fearsome artifact from their rivals on the council. enough to give Cratch wealth and position beyond his wildest imaginings. Indeed, the thought occurred to Cratch, why should he limit himself to ransoming the Wormstone back to only one of the lords? He could contact any number of them, then choose whichever one seemed most likely to afford him protection before closing the deal. Cratch rubbed his paws together in the greedy human gesture of an Altdorf moneylender. With Thanquol gone, the only perceivable obstacle to his ambitions might be Viscit Burnthang, but he had some ideas about how to deal with the warlock engineer. Strike him down, and the other clan scryer metalmongers would quickly submit to Cratch's authority. Yes, Cratch thought as his scampering steps brought him into the moist muck of the sewer. Once Burnthang was out of the way, there could be no one to stop him. The adept blinked in confusion when he found himself snout to snout with the warlock engineer. Burnthang's eyes were wide with fear, his paws raised in the helpless gesture of surrender. All around him, the sneaks of Clan Skall and the survivors of Clan Scryer likewise lifted their hands in defeat. Cratch was about to snarl at the ratmen when he became aware of shapes surrounding them in the reeking corridor of brick and filth. "Adept Cratch, how kind easy you to join find us." The voice was that of Scratch Scarpaw, but the cunning assassin was too wise to emerge from the ranks of his followers and expose himself. Instead, the black-clad killer simply laughed, a long, murderous giggle. "Take Snatch the Stone," Scarpaw snarled to his minions. "Kill, slay the meat." And there you have it. That was the end of Chapter 8. I hope you enjoyed that. It'd be great to hear from you in the comments below. And if anyone's listening, just thank you so much for your support. It's really been great on this series. I look forward to speaking to you all again very soon. Take care and goodbye.